Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 14. My name is Lee. I am in Canada, which unfortunately, because of the setup we've got this week, we won't have a proper video. So apologies to those on YouTube, but we'll definitely have an audio version up on YouTube. So I can't show you my lovely room. But what is lovely is the voices of Vickers and Zeev, who are both joining me this week.
You traitor! I hope you're eating poutine right now.
I wish. It's like 7 in the morning, so it's a bit early for that kind of thing, but I'll get there eventually.
Is there such a thing as too early for poutine?
Well, I'm not a huge fan of melted cheese, so it's just...
It's melted cheese curd.
I know, but it doesn't matter. Just liquid cheese, it's like... It just gives me the weirds, the GBs. Anyway, what is... there's no segue I think I could do that doesn't sound flippant about people being murdered. So this week we're going to talk about...
people kind of look like melted cheese after you run them over with it.
Because that's a terrible thing to say.
And
I had someone had to find the
segue. All your
segue.
complaints to Vickers taking liberty.
That is a really awful thing to say.
Yeah, that was really bad. So this week we're going to talk about London and, well, Brighton as well. In the last 24 hours, there's been supposedly, details aren't fully confirmed yet, but there's been supposed to have been some sort of terrorist incident in Brighton in Melbourne, a hostage situation and a shooting. So yeah, let's talk about... We kind of covered some of this last week, but we're going to talk about it again because it's in the news.
Also, I don't think we're going to get it out of the news for a while now, considering it seems to be happening so frequently.
Yes. Well, let's talk about frequency because realistically, even if it happened 2 or 3 happen in a row, it's still not that often that these sorts of things happen. So they're very high profile. They're talked about a lot, but much like mass shootings, it doesn't seem to me like there is some sort of rash, some sort of outbreak of violence that is unheard of or even.
I'm not going to say unheard of, but I'm definitely going to say... So here's the thing. When you talk statistically, right, about this, it's really over what period of time. And you're absolutely right. If we go over, say, 16 years, all the way back to 2001, picking 9/11 as our starting point, you're absolutely right. They don't happen that often. But if you take a look at this year and you compare it to last year as a trend number, I would say it seems to be up, and it seems to be up from 2015 as well. So it's a trend that's definitely spiking up. The only thing that we can sort of assert from that is it's definitely higher in the last 3 years than I would say the running average for the last 16. The question most statisticians would ask is this a spike or is it a continued upward trend? And only time will answer that.
Yeah, it's a pretty... I don't think 3 years is really, a long enough period to really assess. And considering that in years gone by, like decades gone by, like during, through the Troubles with Northern, in
coincidentally,
England,
Northern Ireland still sees a lot of attacks.
Yeah, and the US during the 60s and 70s, which I think I might have mentioned this last week, there was a massive bombing campaign. We're talking like thousands of attacks. So, yeah, compared to maybe the period of time of 1980 to 2000, yes, there wasn't a whole lot of terrorist attacks going on, but like through other periods of history, there's been a lot of attacks, and it just does. A sort of an uptick in off a very low base doesn't seem to me to suggest there's some sort of outbreak of violence that should draw attention beyond just any response to any sort of isolated incident, which is relatively isolated incident, which is. Okay, did the cops get it right? The cops get it wrong? What can we do next time? Certainly when you have a Prime Minister like Theresa May saying, well, maybe we should regulate speech on the internet, which, considering that the UK has already arrests people for what they tweet about, I think it's pretty, it's a pretty absurd response, really, to these incidents.
But it's not out of the norm. Sorry, I'll let Steve go.
What I would note is that the high-profile incidents that we're talking about are usually incidents that cause a lot of casualties. In this case, they haven't. But when people hear terror attacks nowadays, they naturally recall all the terror attacks and all the mass casualty events of the last 10, 20 years. I think it's fair to say that, or certainly the last 10, almost 20 years from 9/11 onwards. And it's hard for people to accept that this is some kind of statistical blip. It certainly doesn't seem like a statistical blip. It seems like a deliberate onslaught. And look, to some extent, that's a fair comment. The groups may have changed, and they may have differing aims, and to some extent, I mean, the personalities, the faces have changed, but the objectives of terrorism in the modern age for these particular Islamist groups haven't changed all that much. It's still to create terror, it's still to divide, and it's still to draw attention to their cause, and in that way inspire other people to hate or follow them.
And in that regard, they're quite successful.
Yes, they are. Unfortunately, they've been very successful at inflaming a lot of hate. They've been very successful at, unfortunately, persuading people to join them. And we really have to sit back and ask ourselves why these groups have gained power. And it's tragic, but we need to look at it seriously and not look at it merely as an isolated incident or merely as a statistical blip. Yeah.
But from the perspective of, I guess, as a libertarian, I kind of sit there and go, like, I'm particularly intrigued by how the state apparatus works during this time. And the reason why I say that is, if you take a look at it, as Lee pointed out, Theresa May is now looking to effectively regulate speech on the internet. Now, we would have regarded that as a very left-wing thing here in Australia, because that was the goal of Stephen Conroy. And he was rightly criticised quite thoroughly for that sort of behaviour, both by the political right and the political left at the time. And if you take a look at it now, through the vehicle of anti-terrorism, they're able to gain a lot more traction than they would have previously. But like, if you want to take a look at it, another example of that is the labour union movements and basically the nationalists all coming together on, hey, let's use this to basically drum up, an ethno-state, effectively, right? Where we want to prevent foreigners coming from certain regions for certain types of beliefs that they hold. Which is an old school Labour philosophy. I mean, in Australia, it went under the name of White Australia policy for a long time. So the state apparatus's way of using these incidences is far more interesting to me than the actual incident itself, because it's basically a case of people going, don't let a tragedy go to waste.
Mm. Well, yes, and it's important to bear in mind that there is no single explanation for all of these attacks. I think I would say that there are more than a few explanations, and all of them need to be put together, so to speak, to really understand what's going on. The first one, and perhaps the most controversial, is the concept of blowback, or basically the idea that perhaps intervening in Iraq or Syria is actually causing much more attention and much more terrorism in countries that actively intervene.
You're right that that's controversial, and I don't buy that argument. I would have bought it in 2011 when forces were still there, but if you take a look at it, the US pulled out of Iraq in 2011. The US has no boots on the ground currently in Syria. In fact, it's the Russians that have the boots on the ground in Syria. So if anyone should be experiencing blowback right now, it's the Russians. And the blowback appears to be targeted to effectively Western democracies. And largely, in these Western democracies, it's coming from people with a fundamentalist view of, it's not, some people would contend it's not Islamic, and some people would go it's a literal reading of Islam. I don't want to get into that debate because, well, I have no reason to get involved in that debate, and quite frankly, it doesn't make sense. But, the point is, the blowback argument, in my opinion, no longer stands. And it doesn't stand unless you believe that the Western democracies are owed a blood debt greater than Russia currently from the Middle East.
Well, I don't know if that's quite what the argument is. It's not so much an argument about blood debt as such. I think it would be an argument about the present intervention in as much as there is one in the Middle East. And
maybe 10 years ago, but not now.
Even now there is some intervention. In Syria there was intervention, and certainly there are still some US troops in Iraq right now. I mean, right now they are being used as advisors or what have you, but they are still being used. And similarly, the American state continues to fund the Iraqi government, and in turn it continues to fund Syrian militia groups. Now, I'm not saying that it is the only explanation, and nor am I suggesting that it is, something that we need to accept as a universal truth, that, it is the occupation and the American evil and all of that. I'm simply saying that as a propaganda tool for groups such as ISIS, it is a powerful thing to claim that they are being attacked by the West, as indeed to some extent they are. Not to the extent of a full occupying army anymore, that's true, but to some extent.
But
now,
I mean,
yeah, sorry, I don't want to dwell on that too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideology of ISIS doesn't really need much motivation. Like, it's got all the hatred towards the West that it ever needs. I think it's more the fact that it seems to be almost exclusively second generation, or very, very, very sort of young first generation migrants. It's kind of hard to really understand why. And I mean, I think in some ways I think Vickers is right. Trying to understand the reasoning is not necessarily going to get you very far. I think the left's, if you think of sort of broadly of kind of the left-wing response being that, Islam is never to blame. It's always, let's not talk about it. That's a bad approach. I think the right take, which is it's always Islam and Islam is the same everywhere, I think is also bad. Shameless self-promotion time. I did a video talking about this kind of thing on my YouTube channel where, and I said, well, what Islam are we talking about? There's not just one Islam. There are dozens of Islam, versions, and only a handful of them sort of promote this kind of violence.
But even still, it is kind of a large number right now that are committing these acts. At least in a way that's getting them recognized in the media. It is certainly not only the Muslims committing the attacks, but then that's a false equivalence, in my opinion, right? Because right now it's these particular groups that are out there getting in the media and killing a lot of people in a very public way.
Look, it's certainly religion is a factor. I don't think, obviously, as Lee said, that there are many interpretations of Islam, and one of them is causing this, in a sense, the spread of one of them, the fundamentalist interpretation. I think there are some other possible explanatory factors. The two that come to mind for me, first of all, and note again, I don't say it's the comprehensive explanation for all attacks. One is the fact that there is a kind of a welfare dependency model, not just in the UK, but also in places like France or Sweden, that is taking hold in communities with few skills and with little to go on when they migrate, and then in turn they're prevented from working because of regulations like occupational licensing, the minimum wage, and just the fact that they have few skills. So a combination of those factors creates a community that is basically milling around, jobless, and looking for someone to blame for their troubles.
Actually,
And that in turn offers a very big opportunity for radical demagogues to pin the blame on someone else. Go on.
Yeah, sorry. So this is actually something that I kind of do agree with the Conservatives on. Sorry, Steve, you're giving a little bit of feedback again. But yeah, so this is something that the Conservatives have been saying, which I think is actually true and does warrant some, I guess you could say, some sort of acknowledgement. And that is that the Conservatives keep saying that the political left in a lot of countries create a figurative fifth column of not just minorities, but like of people that are basically stuck in welfare traps, and they continually perpetuate this idea that these people are on welfare because they're victims. And they're victims to the extent that they're victims of left-wing policies, like mentioned occupational licensing. Occupational licensing is a favourite thing of the union movement. They want to make it as hard to fire people as possible, and one of the ways you do that is by requiring a lot of qualifications to put people into the job into the first place. The other way is obviously to shrink the size of the labour pool, which is what the immigration policies are meant for. They find a way to import basically effectively a fifth column of, I like to call them pets, but they're basically a contingent voting class that will likely vote for them election after election, and purely on the basis of welfare and purely on the basis of certain government programs, and basically stoke up this entire thing that they are victims, they are oppressed by the majority population.
By late-stage capitalism.
And capitalism as well, yeah. So this is something that the Conservatives believe, which not only does warrant recognition, but also should be called out for what it is.
Well, I don't know whether that is the intention entirely behind bringing these people here for people who support.
No, I don't. Hang on. No. I don't think they bring them in. I think they create a policy to allow them in, and then they basically create a welfare trap out of that.
Yeah. Right. I don't know if that's a product of deliberate design, though. I think that's probably just a product of their unwillingness to understand what the policy consequences are. But leaving that aside,
you can find plenty, including Saul Alinsky, plenty of leftists that have said, if we do this for X amount of years, we will have a voting base that'll continuously vote left-wing, irrespective of what they believe. And that's been said, that they're on the record as saying that that's those sort of things.
Great respect, Saul Alinsky is one man, and I don't know if I'm going to hold that entire voting blocks of people quite.
You don't have to hold the entire voting block. You just have to hold the policymakers.
Yeah, but even them, I'm really skeptical of the idea that they're all Alinskyites. Now, look, the next point that deserves some mention is that I think it is arguable to some extent that even obviously the people who came here are in some cases perpetrators, but it has to be borne in mind that in as much as they're acting for a cause, the cause itself exists because in some cases the refugees aren't allowed to leave. Now, if you look at cases like Syria or Iraq, ISIS, however you wish to call it, has created a massive humanitarian crisis, which in turn stokes the conflict further as part of the general war. Now, one way to dampen that crisis is to have people leave the area and move somewhere else, forget what their previous lives were, forget the conflict, and just live normal lives as ordinary people. And unfortunately, because the current situation is that people aren't letting people freely move around and seek refuge elsewhere, the result of that is that the conflict continues and is more bloody than it would otherwise be. And, well, let's put that to the rest of the to yourself and to Lee, of course.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think so. One of the things about the don't know his first name, but Betty, the guy who blew himself up outside of in the Manchester attack. I mean, he went to Libya, and it's thought that he went to Syria in the weeks leading up to the attack in Manchester. Where supposedly he might have got training from ISIS. Because his family, some of his family is still in Libya, so that was the justification for him going. So, I mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean by not letting refugees move around, because clearly, I mean, he was able to go back to these places and then come back into the UK, and where he then, attacked.
What I mean is simply that there are masses of refugee camps and refugees in the area, and there they stay. And in as much as they stay in and around Iraq and Syria doing nothing, they remain as...
what he's saying is to bring them back to a normal life. So yes. if you're not going back to, your regular schedule of working, maintaining a home and all of that, you're basically listening to imams who are radicalizing you and telling you it's all someone else's fault that you're here. Exactly. There is some merit to what he's talking about, because if I recall correctly, this is what happened in Jordan when the first wave of PLO refugees went across, and they de-radicalized a lot of them by what Zeev's talking about, is by getting them jobs, by getting them basically to work effectively. I mean, it didn't stop Yasser Arafat from trying to assassinate the king, but aside from all of that...
it meant that a lot of people exited the movement. And in this case, again, it means that a lot of people will exit the conflict, be they potential recruits, as in members of the ordinary population, or actual people, actual participants too.
Yeah, someone who's busy...
We're not seeing refugees committing these attacks. We're seeing the children of refugees.
That's true.
And the reason, in the case of Mohammed Abedi, I don't know what his name is, that guy, his parents weren't refugees from conflict because of radical Islam. They were refugees from Gaddafi. So the
political conflict, political refugees.
Yeah. So, they were political
refugees. Absolutely right.
They came to the UK. Their son was born and raised in this community, and, in some way, I mean, people talk about, maybe they're alienated. I mean, I just think they're sociopaths. Like, there's... if you have a big enough population, there's going to be some people out there who just hate others, and it just happens that this is the excuse.
Yeah,
but one thing I would point out is that the fact that these migration restrictions exist is prolonging these broader socio-political conflicts in the Middle East. The most obvious example is the cases like Libya, Iraq,
I think there might be
Syria.
There might be a mouse or something.
Oh no, there's drama.
No, Zev's got a mouse. He's gone. He's gone. He's now on a mouse hunt.
He's running. He's hiding. He's
Isn't this why you own a cat, dude?
Oh, he's gone. He's really gone.
He's gone. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And now we have proof that Zeev's cat is unable to take care of a simple mouse. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, probably says more about Zeev's cat than it does about Zeev. But I actually don't accept your... Sorry, just to bring it back. Yeah, just to bring it back. I don't actually accept your premise that it's the children of refugees always, because, that is, like I told last week, that is absolutely true in Europe, where that is definitely a trend. But if you take a look at what's happening in Australia, all of our attackers have been, this generation of refugee, right? Like, you had Mans Monas, who came over from... Sorry, what?
He's an outlier in that he was older. Most of the
we've only had the two attacks. I don't know if we can say outliers.
Well, yeah, that's true. But if you look at sort of the overall trend, it seems to be young men. It's not.
True.
I mean, he was already up for charges of a range of other things, which is probably why he thought, I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory rather than go to prison for murder or attempted murder or whatever it was he was charged with. But there was the guy, who ran, there was the Burke Street Mall attack where he's a young guy. You've got Curtis Cheng, who some teenager shot him. It's young men who are being drawn into this sort of thing.
Well, generally, it's young men that's easy. It's the most easy to radicalize.
Yeah,
but
as somebody who was a young man not long ago, I can understand why you'd be drawn into this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But we always
look for something to believe, right? That's why we're libertarians.
Yeah.
The day there's a libertarian terrorist, we're going to be in so much trouble.
Well, speaking of it, it's interesting because there were actual anarchist attacks in the late 19th century.
Yeah, but they weren't
A range
real
of them.
anarchists.
I think they were real anarchists.
Real
It's like
anarchists
radical-
work
like-
inside the
like
system
anarcho-
and change it from the inside.
Well, they tried to change they tried to change it from the inside by
idea
blowing
what
up a
that
bunch of
means, Lee,
judges
but I
and
think for most
politicians.
people that would be maybe white noise. I don't know if anyone would understand the politics of 19th century anarchism.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I think they're all socialist anarchists anyway.
Yeah, but
how about we talk about the advice that the police gave?
actually,
yeah.
no. I want to talk about Dan Andrews, who has apparently said,
Okay.
and I quote, apparently, because it came out like literally 20 minutes ago, he said, terrorism is just part of Australia's life culture now.
What?
Yeah, he said we're just going to have to accept it.
This
Hang on,
is
I'll get the
Victorian-
quote. I'll get the quote. So you guys talk, I'll get the exact quote.
This is Dan Andrews, the Victorian Premier, correct?
Correct.
Okay, this will be interesting. Well, yeah. All right. Well, while you're discussing that, let's talk about the advice that they gave because I think this has ruffled some libertarian feathers.
Yep.
The advice that the police gave were okay.
Yeah. So I have the
Go
exact
with your
quote. Okay. Violent extremism is now part of contemporary Australia.
Okay.
But all of us,
Because
Victorians
that's-
and indeed Australians, have to accept that violent extremism is a part of contemporary Australia.
Wow. I imagine Andrew Bolton's going to have something to say about that this morning.
Well, with great respect, because I don't know if that's a statement that means that Dan Andrews is very happy about that. I think he's just stating.
Oh
that.
no! I'm not saying that he's happy. I'm not saying that he's sad. But it leads into the fact of what we're getting into, where the police, what was it again? I'll let you take this, Lee.
Right, so the advice that was given by the Metropolitan Police in the UK was to run, hide, tell, which was a video that came out
Fucking oath.
in the last 24 hours, I think, and then there was the London Bridge attacks.
What happened to that steelish British upper lip? Right, the stiff upper lip. It was keep calm and carry on. Sit there, drink your tea, just put up with those Jerry bombs.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The response that with the libertarian kind of retort has been calm, pull, and shoot, as in stay calm, pull your concealed carry gun out, and then shoot the terrorist.
Oh hell yeah!
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, to be fair, I think that's actually my response in almost all of these situations involving violent people, whoever they are. Like I sort of think I don't care what they believe. It's these things. There's always the potential for these things to happen. So, like, I think it was Brendan O'Neill was the one that stands out in my mind. He responded to people saying, "Well, the risk of being killed by a terrorist is very low," and he said, "Yeah, but terrorism is not just like a fridge falling you. Terrorism is something deliberate." And I think, well, since nobody has any meaningful way of reasonably stopping somebody becoming like this and wanting to carry out this attack, it is like a force of nature. It is, it is as arbitrary as that. And so the only response that we have is to defend ourselves when these things happen, is to be ready to stop somebody from shooting me or stop somebody from stabbing me. I mean, the Manchester attack is unusual in that it was a bomb that was used. What we've seen a lot of in Europe and in Australia is attacks which could be stopped. It was attacks where people have guns or people have vehicles or people have knives, and if you had a weapon, you could defend yourself. It's actually relatively rare from my perspective. You think about the San Bernardino shooter, that was a shooting. You had the Orlando Club, that was a shooting. All of these are situations where you actually could stop the terrorist if you had a gun. So yeah, I mean, I think it's actually it's something terrible to have this. David Leyonhjelm was right in saying that about the Sydney siege. If people did have concealed firearms, they could have stopped him from taking the Lid Cafe.
For sure. And Lionhelm's going to be on in about 3 minutes for us. By the way, yes, we do record at 8:30, so yeah.
It's going to be a shit show. It's going to be so bad. I don't know why people watch Q&A. It is probably the worst TV show on television, and that includes things like a current affair, because at least a current affair doesn't pretend to be something better than it actually is.
I don't know. I mean, it is a bit of an echo chamber, but with great respect, isn't this a bit of an echo chamber? And I guess won't we?
No, this isn't an echo chamber by design, though. That's the difference. Right?
Yeah,
We're an
so
echo
is
chamber
Q&A.
simply because we
Let's
don't.
be-
Yeah.
So is Q&A though. I mean, Q&A is an echo chamber, but they bring one alternative voice on, or two perhaps, and that's what it is.
Well,
given
the way they've set up David Leinholm's appearance, where they've shared articles that have put, the Q&A Facebook page has been sharing articles that paint him in a very negative light. I mean, I think if we had somebody on air, like, we'd probably give them a fair go. Like, we'd actually go out of our way to sort of,
We have in the past.
Yeah, but I don't think Q&A does that. I think they set out to, basically stir up the left-wing intelligentsia, the chattering classes.
Look, I mean, that's one perspective, and it's possible. I grant you that. But, I mean, David Leinholm hasn't been the most popular fellow, even amongst libertarians, and
No.
I guess it's natural in that way to expect that they will take his less flattering side and highlight it, because he doesn't really message, sometimes in a way that is empathetic, shall we say. But
Sure. And I think if we're starting to talk about David Leinholm, we should probably call the episode at that.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say. All right.
we are going a bit off topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fine. It's the last couple of minutes of the show. We can go off topic. All right. Well, that's been another episode of Taking Liberties Radio. We'll be back next week to talk about more things in the world. And so thanks, Steve, for joining us. And thanks, Vickers.
Thank you.
And speak to everybody again next week.
Cool.